Right. From the angle of linguistics, in fact, I'd like to make one remark upon the last speech. Our speaker spoke about adivasis. And of course, that's the common word. You see, if you don't want to particularly draw attention to this terminology, you just use this word because it's there. Like, for example, you have a museum in Gurgaon devoted to tribal art, folk and tribal art, Lok Adivasi Kala. And in fact, I advise you all to go there. But at any rate, that word Adivasi is being commonly used, whereas in fact the word is not so innocent. As in fact I think you said, the word is fairly recent, sometime 1920s, and it's a missionary coinage. You see, the British were clever, but not that clever, but the Jesuits, they were clever. And I know, you see, it's from my country that you had a big Jesuit mission in Chota Nagpur. And in fact, it is thanks to this British policy that they could get a hold there, because they offered legal services to the tribals, because, you know, they were forced to conduct all these trials because they had become criminal overnight. And so, you know, they were too illiterate to do this, and so the Jesuits came to help them. And then, of course, in return, they expected their souls. Now, you see, as part of this policy, they invented the word Adivasi, which sounds perfectly Sanskrit. And so the effect is that many people genuinely think that since time immemorial, the tribals have been called Adivasi, which means original inhabitant. And so yesterday I was shown a civics school book, which is even more thorough in its indoctrination value than history textbooks. And it effectively had a chapter about the Adivasis, and it explained in so many words, yes, of course they are called Adivasis because they are the original inhabitants, implying that the non-tribals are not original inhabitants and are foreign invaders. So you see, this is a really clever disinformation strategy, all in one word. Okay, we're going to talk about the Homeland Debate, and this is an application of the linguistic concept of a language family. So a language family is a group of languages that have an original ancestor, a common ancestor. Here, for example, you see the Uralic language family, which includes Finnic and Hungarian, and then a number of tribal languages in Russia, spoken by like a few hundred people each. So that was the first language family mapped in the 18th century, or in the 17th century even. And so they all had a common ancestor. You can see that if you study the language, even though the oldest language written down was Hungarian in maybe 1000 AD. So that means that the common ancestor, reconstructed to have been spoken 5,000-6,000 BC. So for more than 6,000 years it was unknown, totally unknown, no written records at all. Yet you see clever linguists managed to sort of reconstruct what it must have looked like. No, that's in order to point out, I think. Okay, so I have to do it here. Yes. Okay, so that is the Indo-European language family, the one we're going to talk about. So that was already felt to exist by a few early travelers. But the glory period of this language family is the 19th century. It unites most Indian and European languages. In this case, the Iranian and Indian languages are counted as one group, Indo-Iranian. You could split them in two or in three, in fact. The Dardic languages to which Kashmiri belongs, and then a few others in the Afghan-Pak borderland, they also belong to it. And then you have the rest. You have in green Slavic, in light green Baltic, in red Germanic, in in brown, italic. In yellow you have Greek. And in purple, if you see it, you have Armenian. There are a few extinct groups. The most important one is Hittite. Hittite because it is deemed by Western scholars to be the oldest, though I think they are mistaken. I think Sanskrit is older. But nevertheless, it has a special place in the tree, and a few more. And a very special one is Proto-Bangani. Is an extinct language, but of which a number of loanwords still exist in these dialects in Uttarakhand. Yes. Now, the first person who ever wrote about it was Thomas Stevens, a British Jesuit. And then you have Filippo Sassetti, an Italian traveler, Van Boxhorn, a Dutch traveler. But so they saw only a small part of it. And the first one who really gave a theory of the coherence of the main language groups is William Jones. This is in his 3rd anniversary lecture of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which is better known as the Philologer lecture, because he uses that funny word. The usual form is philologist, and so you will often find it referred to as the Philologer lecture. Then after the concept was started, a new terminology was found for it in French, Indo-Germanique, which Julius von Klaproth translated into German, Indo-Germanisch. In German, that remains the normal term. But the one that conquered the world is the British term by Thomas Young, Indo-European. The term Aryan also came to be used because in studying the Vedas, they found that it was used as a term of self-reference, namely, specifically by one Indian tribe, the Pauravas. But they assumed that it was and it had also been used by the Iranians, and later it was discovered that the Hittites had also used it, and so it was assumed that the Indo-Europeans as a whole also used this term in self-reference. That we don't know because there are no written records of it, but at any rate, even the oldest descendants, the Vedic people, certainly did so. This is important to know because very many people in India say that, oh, it has no ethnic meaning. It means noble. In fact, I hear it all the time. Now, this is not true. You see, later on it came to mean noble, but the original meaning is ethnic. Not any one specific people, but the people in self-reference. So that means that I can call myself Arya and call the foreigner Anarya, and he will call himself Arya and me Anarya. And so it's a relative ethnic term. Yes. The first theory about the homeland of Indo-European located the homeland in India. So there is the out of India theory that nowadays everybody's talking about is not some upstart new marginal hypothesis. No, it is the original theory. And so since William Jones, people expected Sanskrit to be the mother language, the ancestral language from which Greek, Latin, and so on had sprung. And therefore, though in fact that's not really a logical deduction, therefore they assumed that India had to be the homeland. In fact, that was already surmised in the 18th century by people who didn't even know yet the linguistic relationship between European and Indian languages, like Voltaire and Immanuel Kant. Okay, so first half of the 19th century, that still remains the view, gradually giving way to the Aryan invasion theory. The birth of Indo-European studies as a science was in 1816 with the first comparative conjugation study involving Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit by Franz Bopp. Maybe you've never heard that name. Well, you better learn it now because is the most important name in the history of Indo-European studies. And so with that starts the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European from the characteristics of the different daughter languages. They try to reconstruct what the mother language must have looked like. Now, in Indian sources nowadays, I read that, oh, this is ridiculous, this is a ghost language, this has never existed, and so on. Well, yes, you see, a proto-language certainly has existed, but then you should not exaggerate. You see, linguists are very particular about all kinds of funny signs and so on to give the precise sounds of what it must have looked like. Now, that, of course, is an exaggeration because we don't really know what it looked like. We have a... we can surmise, but we're not sure. So this is all between brackets, maybe it's like this. So it's not a ghost language, but it's not much of a... it's a very approximative reconstruction. There are now websites where they actually write in Indo-European. In fact, in Louvain-la-Neuve, there is in my the French section of my home university, there is always a summer course of Oriental languages, and so in 2 weeks immersion, all the time doing Sumerian or Hittite or you can choose. So this year they're going to do a course in spoken Indo-European. People do that, and here you have courses in spoken Sanskrit, so it's. But then again, the difference is that you have Sanskrit texts, whereas Indo-European is totally invented so far. Oh yeah, the asterisk, of course, the asterisk. When a form is unattested and it's written down, then it is marked by an asterisk. Like it should have looked like this. And another big name, and of course I can't do them all, but one that you really should know is August Schleicher. He, he's a little bit notorious because he's the first one to speak of an Indo-Germanisches Urvolk, a primeval Indo-European people. So he starts to clearly ethnicize this Proto-Indo-European. And there's, maybe he was wrong in that, but there's really no harm in that, except that, you see, 80 years later, the German regime started to take this idea too serious and imagined themselves, the Germans, to be closest to this original people. He advocated the Polygenesis of Languages, that is to say, originally already 5,000 years ago or so, there were a number of different languages. Now, that is pretty obvious if you don't go back very far. You see, obviously, 6,000 years ago, there was Proto-Indo-European, there was Proto-Uralic, there was Proto-Sino-Tibetan, and so on. But and so then there are still different languages, though many languages that exist today were one language at that time. But nevertheless, if you go back even farther, then you get greater groupings. This is so-called mega-comparatism, which says, for example, that there was during the Ice Age, like 15,000 years ago, a Nostratic superfamily, which includes Indo-European. Indo-European itself is a construct of a number of modern languages brought back to a common ancestor. Now you go back farther, and you take that common ancestor and the common ancestor of Semitic and the common ancestor of Uralic and of Altaic and so on, and they too turn out to have a common ancestor. That is then called Nostratic. I mention it because in India it has a certain relevance. There's a lot of talk about the relation between Sanskrit and Tamil or between Indo-European and Dravidian. Well, it so happens that they do have a common ancestor. So Sanskrit and Dravidian are related, and I don't mean influenced, that's much later. I mean they are ultimately related. If that, if anybody cares about that, you see, that happens to be the case. They are related in a way that, for instance, both are not related with Chinese or with Maya in America or with the Bushman language. Though ultimately, if you go back even farther, then all languages may be related. But here we talk about the genesis of Homo sapiens like 80,000 years ago. And there are about 40 words in practically all world languages that have a common origin. Like you have the root mulg. This means, in some languages, to suck, or it means the throat, or it means milk, or it means baby, or it means breast, depending on what language, but ultimately the source meaning is a baby sucking at its mother's breast. And so from that are derived a number of meanings, and it's still in practically every language this word exists. But it's not very practical to know. It won't help you in speaking the Bushman language or something. Okay. Well, what more? He is mainly famous for writing the first fairy tale in Indo-European. Just to prove that it's a language that must have really existed, he tried. And so it was about an avis, Yasmin Varna na a ast, dadarka aquams. Okay? An avis, you may recognize the Latin word ovis, which means a sheep. A sheep that on which there was no wool. Varna here is wool. Okay? Dadarka, saw, an aquam, which is an ashwa, a horse. Okay, so a sheep saw a horse, and then the rest of the story is, and it saw that this horse, some horses were pulling wagons, some were carrying weight, and some were carrying a man, so that he could go fast rather than walking. And, he commiserated with the horses, but the horses said, "What are you commiserating? You yourself are miserable. Look, you're naked. You see, a man, a boss, you see, he has shorn you. He has taken your wool to make a garment for himself, and you are naked. Look, we commiserate with you." And then after hearing this, the sheep went out in the field. That's what the story says. You can see that he still likens Proto-Indo-European to Sanskrit. Like he says aquam, assuming that the vowels are both a, aqua. Now in Latin it is equus, so the a was later found by Indo-European scholars, is in fact e, and the second a is in fact o. And so equo becomes ashwa. And so this way, this is an example of how gradually the original Proto-Indo-European was removed step by step from Sanskrit. Originally, it was practically Sanskrit. And then you see they saw a number of ways in which Sanskrit was in fact an evolved form. Like, for instance, this change from A to A, or O to A. The disappearance of A and O in many Sanskrit forms, all becoming A. And that's one. Or the kva, E kvus, becoming shva, ashwa. Okay, so that way, more and more difference was created between Sanskrit and Proto-Indo-European, from which the not-so-logical deduction was made that therefore the homeland must have been somewhat removed from India. Because you see, all these changes may have taken place in one homeland. There needn't have been a distance covered between a homeland and India. That homeland may still have been India itself. Okay, Schleicher also started the Stammbaum theory, the genealogical tree theory, saying that, you see, the relation between languages could be likened to the branches of a tree. Against that, another scholar, Johannes Schmidt, had the Wellen theory, the wave theory, which emphasized that languages also influence each other. And that is, of course, also true, but only secondarily. Now, when you learn a language, primarily you will simply continue the language that your parents spoke. And then gradually, as you grow, you hear on TV this new word, you start using it. And so the language gets influenced by the surroundings, but nevertheless, mainly it continues what the grandparents and so on spoke. Then the Aryan invasion theory. Now we are there. So from about 1820 onwards, gradually the out of India theory gave way. By mid-century, it was all Aryan invasion theory. And so they thought that the homeland was someplace else, in Bactria or in Atlantis or in the Balkans or so. From the 1920s onwards, under the impulse of scholar Gordon Childy, you have a growing consensus for Russia, Western Russia as the homeland. So from the Indian viewpoint, that becomes an Aryan invasion theory, otherwise they couldn't have ended up in India. In India, they tend to identify this theory with Max Müller. In fact, Max Müller just elaborated whatever work had already been done in Germany 50 years before him. And so he invented nothing new. He was only extremely productive and influential. That much is true. And so this is what you see everywhere and all the time. What they imagine is the map of the spread of Indo-European. Now, why that scenario seems right, you go to Indo-Europeanist conferences and you just ask around, you see what makes you so sure? And one thing they spontaneously will say, oh yeah, it lies neatly in the middle, this homeland, between Ireland and Bengal. And yet, you see, that is an argument against. Because languages normally don't spread symmetrically. When they spread, they usually spread from one corner in one direction. Like the Bantu language was spoken in Northwest Africa, and it spread, there's a language of a population practicing agriculture. It spread all over Africa to the Cape, or almost. Like Nelson Mandela spoke Xhosa, which is a Bantu language. And so it didn't spread to the north. Now, of course it didn't, because to the north of its homeland is the Sahara Desert. You can't practice agriculture in the Sahara. So the reasons why people migrate are rarely symmetrical. And so to find this homeland neatly in the middle is not impossible, but statistically very unlikely. Contrary what is assumed. Then, from the angle of Europe, this Aryan invasion theory makes sense because we have had our own Aryan invasion. And in this case, in the 3rd millennium BC, you have plenty of both archaeological and genetic evidence that shows a big invasion coming from Russia, with, a culture, the type of pottery, clothing, and so on, that later on turns out to be typical of populations speaking Indo-European languages. So very probably these are the Indo-Europeans bursting into Europe. And pretty violently, like in whole tracts, like in Germany, the population was completely replaced. The original population disappeared. Either they fled or they were massacred. So that's what an Indo-European invasion would look like. And that precisely is what in India is completely missing. So that's why archaeologists point to the fact that there is no change, there is no discontinuity, there is no sign of an Aryan invasion. Whereas in Europe there is plenty of it. Now, from looking from Europe, you see them coming from the Russian steppes. And that's what they did. However, you don't know what they did before. And so as Paul Haggerty, who is now one of the leading Indo-Europeanist scholars, has said, this culture of Yamna, which is the place in Russia where supposedly they came from, that is not the original center. You see, that is a center from where they came into Europe, but where they came before they were there, that is another question. But so chronologically, it can't be the homeland. Chronologically, you have reasons to deduce, long story, but you have reasons to deduce that we're talking about some 6,000 BC. And so this Yamna culture is 1,000 years too late. And from the Indian viewpoint, this is perfect. You see, of course, they came from India, and then they settled in Yamna, and then later on, after some transformations, they went into Europe. Yes, demographic common sense is the one about the Bantu languages I explained. Then you have the fact that India is a demographic giant. And so all the invaders into India, they linguistically assimilated. You know, the Huns invaded into India. Well, there is no Hunistan or, you know, Hun Pradesh or something. No, you see, the Huns cannot be found anymore. They have assimilated. And so the converse effect is that if people emigrate from India, they very rarely assimilate. Or, like the Mitanni people gradually assimilated in Syria, that's true. But in Central Asia especially, even a very small percentage of India became a very large percentage in thinly populated Central Asia. And so it was easy for them to maintain their language and to impose their language, or to, you know, influence others to take over the language. Last year there was a big jubilant title in the Hindu and other anti-Hindu newspapers. Geneticists have proven the Aryan invasion. Now, first of all, if you say that genetics has proven the Aryan invasion, it means that clearly you don't know what you're talking about. If you say genetics has disproven the Aryan invasion, you also don't know what you're talking about. But because the thing is, genes don't speak. And so whatever genes people have, they may adopt a language, they may change language. You don't know. So all that genetics has proven is that people came into India. And so it is said that 17% of Indian males have genes that show that they come from outside. Well, why not? That's what Indian history says. You see, the Scythians came, the Hunas came, the Kushanas came, the Greeks came, then the Turks, the Afghans. They also brought Ethiopian slave soldiers. They also, you know, sent the Syrian Christians as refugees, the Parsis as refugees. They all came into India. They all make up the 17% of newcomers. And yet, not one of these groups has maintained its language. Some have maintained their script, Persians, and, you know, some have imported quite a few words. But nevertheless, they have all assimilated. Even Urdu speakers, they use some Persian Arabic words, but their language mainly is Hindi. So there's nothing special about any invasion. If at all it had been shown that there had been an invasion, of which I'm not at all convinced, but nevertheless, whatever the story, it is no problem for the out of India theory. Then there is the question of rootedness. Namely, in Sanskrit you have a lot more linguistic coherence internally. The other branches of the family show far more changes, show far more borrowing from other languages. And this discovery should be credited to Sri Aurobindo. He writes in his Secret of the Veda about the word varka, where he says, yes, this word means wolf, but it is ultimately a verbal root which means to tear. So, you know, this animal was called that terror. And so that, you know, became the wolf. At the time when I read it, I immediately saw, but this is very important. And so, you know, I invented a few more, like the word name exists in practically all branches of Indo-European, nama in Sanskrit, but in Sanskrit, unlike in all the other branches, It is a derivative of a verbal root. Nam, like in namami, I address, I greet, or namaste. So you see there is a deeper root underlying the word nama. Unfortunately, I left it at that, but fortunately, Nicolas Casanas took it up seriously. And so he came up with 390 or so roots of that type. For example, an means to breathe or breath. In Sanskrit, it is part of a whole family of words like prana, the prefix pra, tied to the root an. In other branches, you only have derivatives, like animos in Greek, which means the wind, or anima in Latin, which means soul. And so a few more examples, like sunu, son, comes from a verb su, which means to create, to generate, or pater, which becomes pita. In Sanskrit still shows a verbal root pa, which means to protect, which isn't visible anymore in the other branches. Or a very good example is Saraswati. Saraswati comes from a verbal root sar, which means to flow, to stream, or to move quickly. And there is a whole family of words, based on that dhatu. By contrast, in Iranian, and it is pretty close to Sanskrit, none of those words exist. Only the finished word Saraswati exists. In Persian pronunciation, Harahvaiti, which is the name of a river in Afghanistan. And so Michael Witzel and all these other people who believe in the Aryan theory say, they had a river there, and then when they came into India, they used that same name to, name the Saraswati River. No, it is the other way around. There are plenty of connections with the name Saraswati because this is an old name, and then they took that name with them when they went to Afghanistan, and there they called it Harahvaiti, even while forgetting about all the basic words like the verbal root sar. Incidentally, Harahvaiti is also the basis of the name of the ethnonym Croatia, because the Croats, in fact, they themselves say Hrvat, and Hrvat is, of course, a short form of Harahvaiti. By the way, so that was originally an Iranian tribe that moved from Afghanistan all the way to the Balkans and adopted the Slavic language in the process, but retained the name Hrvat. That's just by the way. Then the matter of loanwords. In Germanic, there are like 30% loanwords. In Greek, even more, because they borrowed heavily from a native language. They settled in a land that they conquered, and they borrowed a lot from the native language. There are no signs of that in Sanskrit. Sanskrit is, the old Vedic Sanskrit is the purest in the European language. And you see, I know that in the West they frown upon the word purity. They think that you are going to say something about pure race or something. That has nothing to do with it. It just so happens mathematically, you can start counting loanwords. Well, there are very few in Sanskrit. Even a very generous estimate by Michael Witzel says 4%, as opposed to 40% in Greek. There is the pattern of loanwords, like there are a lot of Iranian and a few Indo-Aryan loanwords in the Uralic languages, like Oria, which is the word Arya, only it means slave. It means that at some point the Finnish and Hungarian tribes took Iranians as slaves, and they took their ethnonym, and so they called these people Oria, slave. Anyway, there are also a lot more prestigious terms there. Most cultural terms in the Uralic languages are from Iranian. And so you can see the clear pattern. The Iranians were the superior class, and the locals were Uralic speaking. So you can see that the Iranians went there. It is not the other way around. Suppose they had first lived there in the steppes in Western Russia and were in contact with the Uralic people, then they would have borrowed Uralic words and taken them along to Iran and India. But that's not the case. There are no Uralic loanwords in Sanskrit. So what happened is the other way. Some Iranians went all the way there and imparted their vocabulary. So that's another argument for the Indian homeland. Now, I'm sorry. No accident happened? Okay. Is everybody seated comfortably? Has anybody ever seen The Face of the Devil? Well, you see, this is Michael Witzel. That everybody dealing with this debate has certainly already heard about. Michael Witzel, professor in Harvard. Now, he very much believes in the Aryan invasion theory, and he thinks some arguments for it are these. Some words in Sanskrit are borrowed, and he thinks they are borrowed from the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a culture that existed in Bactria about 2000 BC. So he says those are the Indo-Iranians on their way from Russia into Iran and India. And so a few of these loanwords, Ishtaka, which means brick, it appears in the Vedas, but only at the end. So what he says, in fact, is, first they borrowed this word in Afghanistan, then they came into India. They saw all these Harappan cities with bricks. Nevertheless, they never talked about bricks. And then later, at the end, centuries later, they started using this word Ishtaka. Well, that is improbable. It's more likely that first they lived in India, they had no bricks, no Ishtaka. Then, you see, they went to Afghanistan and they built something there, and that was Ishtaka. And maybe they borrowed the word, why not? Maybe they borrowed it in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, its pattern of borrowing shows that they came from India and then went to Afghanistan, not the other way around. Or, for instance, he mentions the word parsha, which means a sheaf. And unfortunately, there it is not a loan word. It's an Indo-European word, which you also have in Greek, Perse, like in the goddess named Persephone. Or, alternatively, maybe the Greeks, along with the Indic people, did borrow it. Maybe they went through Afghanistan on their way to Greece. That is, of course, also possible, but that would also confirm the Indian homeland. Then a second group, which he identifies as paramunda words. So he finds a number of words in Sanskrit that do not exist in Greek or the other branches, and that have the characteristic that they start with a prefix ka, ku, ki, or something. Like one example, he gives the word kumara, a young man. Now, he doesn't say they are Munda words, because those words have not been identified in any Munda language, but nevertheless, they follow the sound pattern of Munda, and as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing against the idea that there were Munda-speaking or Paramunda-speaking people somewhere in West India, and that Sanskrit borrowed those words from them. You see, of course, you see, at some point, Sanskrit or the Indo-Aryan languages bordered on Munda languages. And yes, once in a while, they may have borrowed a word from there. That's normal between neighboring languages. So, yeah, maybe so. I mean, I don't know any Munda language. I can't analyze the merits of this. But suppose it is true, well, it is no problem at all for the Indian homeland theory. Or their absence of loanwords. For example, in Europe, all the river names are clearly have influence from the earlier spoken language. Like in France, in Spain, you find many river names that are Basque, where Basque has been displaced by Latin, which then became French or Spanish. But the river names remained. Now, that is not the case in India. The river names in northwest India are pure Sanskrit. And among the loanwords, it is also noteworthy that Dravidian is not there. Some people say that the Harappan culture was Dravidian speaking. Well, there is at least no indication of that. So there may have been, yes, there may have been some borrowed words, but not from Dravidian. It is only later when Indo-Aryan started expanding southwards, and I don't mean to Tamil Nadu, I mean to Gujarat, which was probably Dravidian speaking at the coast. And so when they came into contact with Dravidian, then you get words like mina, which is fish. But you see, that's a later influence. So that's not an influence on Vedic. Linguistic paleontology was used in the beginning to prove that the homeland was in Western Europe, because there was a tree, the beech, which is found all over in France and so on, and which is not found in India or even in Russia. So they deduced, therefore there must have been beaches since that word was there, and so that's where the homeland was. Now that's a completely false reasoning, because if they came from somewhere else where no beaches were, and they came into beach territory in Western Europe, well, they would, borrow a local word, whatever the local people called that tree, they would call that tree also like that. And that's how the word fagus or beach came into these Western European languages. Or they may have taken the name of a tree that existed in India and reapplied it to this new tree in Europe. That could also have happened. I mean, there are a number of scenarios where words change meanings or where words disappear that could explain the distribution of words throughout Indo-European. Favorite here and still used is the idea that there are names for animals of cold regions, like the bear and the wolf, and that this proves it must have been a cold region. Now, in fact, the bear and the wolf exist all over the Indo-European territory, including India. And as for cold, you have islands of cold climate in India. I mean, maybe not in Tamil Nadu, but in Kashmir you do. And so even animals belonging to cold climate are still there, are still familiar to Indians. Conversely, there are also animals from hot climate, and that you do not find in islands in Northern Europe or in Russia. Like, for instance, we do not have apes, yet the word ape is an Indo-European word. We do not have elephants, and yet elephant is an Indo-European word. And here I refer to Shrikant Alagiri, who is present in this hall, who has wonderfully shown that the word elephant is a real, legitimate Indo-European word that either has been transformed into some other meaning, like ulbandhus in Gothic means a camel, but so that is very much present in most of Indo-European languages, even though there is only one Indo-European speaking country that has elephants, which is India. Another case of linguistic paleontology that is valid, there are in all Indo-European languages 6 different words for the parts of a car. Now, that is a typically Indo-European technology. You see, we, the Indo-Europeans, we invented the wheel. We came too late to invent the fire and too early to invent the atomic bomb, but at least the car, that's us. And it is a very important invention because it probably explains why the Indo-Europeans could spread so far, because that's dramatic and without any counterpart. So if you invade, if you have a group of adventurous young men on horseback, they invade, they conquer a country. The next thing they do is to take wives from the local population who raise the children in their own local language, and within 2 generations, your language is forgotten. Instead, you see, if you have carts in which you take along your wife and children, then you see you can replace the population, you can bring in your own people, maintaining your language, and then, of course, you can spread your language. So these carts were very useful, and by the time the neighbors had them, the Indo-Europeans were there from the west to the east. Well, this is Shrikant Alagiri, in case you don't recognize him. So this I'm really charmed by this discovery of the presence of the elephant. Then isoglosses are common changes in languages showing that for a while they were united before they went their own ways. Like, for instance, you have a word penkwe, which means 5, pancha in Sanskrit. Now there is a rule that this p becomes kw, and that applies to Celtic and to Italic both. So they may have spent some time together, and that's why they speak of Italo-Celtic languages. Now, a more important find is that, well, I'll leave this for time reasons, but in the southern belt between Greece and India, you have a number of isoglosses of common linguistic developments that are not typical for the whole family, only for those languages, showing that they have spent some time together, like the augment, which is a vowel in front of the verb in past tenses, like the negative word ma or me in Greek, or the change from S to H, like sapta in Sanskrit, but hafta in Persian and hepta in Greek. So those changes suggest that Greek, also Armenian, went from India. And you see, if they had come from Russia, then you could not explain that Greek went to the west and Iranian went to the east. Where were they ever together? Okay, they were together in the homeland, but Germanic and all the others were also there. So they should also show this change, and they don't. That is because outside the homeland, Iranian and Greek were together, where the others were not. So that happened in South Asia. So to conclude, it is a misconception, and it is very common in India, but it is a misconception that linguistics has somehow proven the Aryan invasion. You see, at most it may be compatible with it. It has certainly not proven it. And I think cases like what I just explained about the isoglosses, sorry for being a bit technical, but those already militate a bit against the Russian or even more westerly homeland. As for genetics, archaeology, also comparative philosophy, comparative mythology, and so on, I haven't gone into those. But each of them, I can assure you, fails to give the proof of the Aryan invasion. Sometimes they also do something more and argue for the out of India scenario, but certainly they fail to support the Aryan invasion theory. Thank you.
I want to ask you about two words. Asur. You have in India.
Yeah.
And it goes west, you have the entire nations of Asuria, which is modern Syria, and Asurbanipal, the whole culture. Then the other word is Danu, Danavas, from whom you have the Danavas.
Yes.
In the west, you have the river goddesses.
Yes, of course.
All the rivers, Danube, Dnieper, all of them. I mean, I may be pronouncing it wrong. I would like your opinion on these two words.
Yes.
The second thing is slightly not related to your lecture, but what do you think is the origin of the South Indian languages? Because were they just sitting there all the time?
Yes. Okay, let's start with the second. No, they were not sitting there all the time. You see, some of the Aryan invasion theorists sort of break ranks with their South Indian fans because they also think that the Dravidian languages have invaded. Maybe a bit earlier, but still invaded. And so you have a language Elamite in Iran, which they think is related to Dravidian, closely related, and they think that that is where Dravidian came from. Also, Dravidian is clearly related to Uralic, which is spoken in Central Asia and farther west. And so either they came from South India, but the more usual theory is that they came from, Afghanistan or somewhere there. And so Dravidian is deemed to be related to Indo-European, And so all of them together, Altaic and so on, they must have been spoken somewhere between like Bactria and Mesopotamia, either of the two. And I think it is not Mesopotamia personally. But so at any rate, not South India. They think that South India, originally had other languages that have disappeared, tribal languages, and that Dravidian is already an overlay. As for Danu, obviously, comes from India, and then you have all the rivers that are named after Dnieper, Don, Donau, and so on. There's no mystery about that. The word was also used as an ethnic name, like Danaoi. The Greeks called themselves Danaoi. Then as for Asura, well, that is, of course, very interesting. You've written a great book about it. But here it comes from a root Ansu, which means vitality, life, power. And therefore, it has also as a meaning God. And in Scandinavian, it is simply the word for the gods are the ICHR. Now, in India specifically, there is a historical twist. Some of the gods are called Asuras, especially Varuna. And you see, then there was a conflict between Indians and Iranians, or Proto-Indians, Proto-Iranians. So the Iranians specifically worship this Asura, namely Varuna, addressing him as Asura Medha, which is in Iranian Ahura Mazda. So because of this conflict, the word Asura got a negative meaning, and so then it changed over into demon and so on, but ultimately it served as an ethnic designation of the Iranians. Yes.
I have a question about another word which sounds similar, like you said about centum and shatam.
Yeah.
Now, similarly, there are two words like center and kendra.
Yeah.
Kendra, which became later Kendra in Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Is it possible that Kendra comes from the Proto-Bangani kentum?
No. No.
Because, okay.
No, there is a very simple explanation. Kendra is a loan word. It comes from Greek. You see, there are in so-called Vedic astrology, this is really Hellenistic astrology. So it came after Alexander. In fact, it came about 2nd, 3rd century AD, that it was integrated in Indian culture. And here, because of the Indian spirit and mentality, it took a great flight. It was very successful. But it came from Hellenistic culture, and they had essentially brought it from Babylonia after Alexander conquered that. And so many of the terms from horoscopes and so on are really Greek. Like hora is the Greek word for hour. Like kendra is the Greek word for the part of a horoscope on an angle. So either in the east on the ascendant or in the south on the midheaven. That's kendra. So kendra in a sense means a center, the middle. And so that has been borrowed. That cannot serve our purposes of comparing languages.
Two questions.
Yeah.
You had a specific point about the meaning of the word Arya, right? And you specified that it's ethnic, correct, in your presentation. Mm-hmm. I'd like to understand, does the word have a range of meanings? And I asked this after having recently conducted with my co-author a 13 sources study of the occurrences of the term Arya, starting from the Vedas until Abhigyana Shakuntalam and Kumara Sambhavam. So are you saying that there's only one meaning of the word Arya, or are you saying that there's a range?
There is one root meaning. In fact, you could go even further, because Arya is clearly a derivative from Ari.
Correct.
Now, Ari originally seems to mean a boss, but a chieftain, but it also acquires a negative meaning, which it often has in the Vedas, meaning the man to be beaten. Like you see in a contest, a running contest, the man who's running in front, everybody else wants to overtake him. So he becomes the enemy. The leader is the enemy. Okay? And so that is more or less the background of the word Ari. So now, by the time this derivative was introduced, probably it still simply had the meaning of the leader.
So your answer is there's a range of meanings and not just...
Well, no, there is not really a range of meanings. There is one meaning which like expands into several meanings. Like
Sure.
the meaning of noble is a derived meaning. You see, first it means like the family of the chieftain, the upper class, the elite. And so later it develops a sociological meaning, noble in the sense of upper class.
Right.
And from there you get a metaphoric derivation, or in the moral sense, you see noble in the sense of magnanimous and so on. The same development you have in English. Noble originally means upper class, and then comes to mean magnanimous and all the rest.
Thank you. That's one. And second question is the law of palatals, right? Amongst the laws,
Yeah.
which are kind of key and central to Indo-European.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a scientifically valid law as it
No.
exists as of now?
Yes, you see, to change sh into k, that is upstream. That is not what people normally do.
Right.
By contrast, to change k into sh or ch, that happens all the time in languages all over the world. Peking becomes Beijing, so k becomes j. You know, like in African languages, a language is called ki, like Congo. However, you have Luba, so the ki has become chi. Eh? I mean, anywhere, like within the Indo-European languages, you have it too. Like the word cantum itself is ka in classical Latin. In church Latin, it becomes chantum. And then in Italian, it's cento. In French, it is cent, and so on. These changes happen all the time. It's practically the most common sound change in a language. So the distinction between Satam languages and Cantum languages goes only so far.
Right. So that's one aspect of the law of palatals. But the dethronement of Sanskrit, as seen by the linguists from within their field, is when the Greek, the so-called 5-vowel array of the PIE substitutes the so-called primary vowels of Sanskrit. But isn't there a juxtaposition of categories of native traditions versus, for instance, I mean, the fact that the matra difference between an A and a O, between an A, E and U, right? There might be a matra difference, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these swaras were missing in the Panini, when you look at the Maheshwara Sutrani, whereas the whole logic of replacing it with Greek and saying that the Greek supports it, is that really scientifically valid?
Well, you see, in history, very few things are really certain. You know, if you make a discovery that can upset the whole picture. Like in this case, for instance, if the language of Harappa gets deciphered, we may still face some surprises. But it is pretty certain. Like the form in Sanskrit, for instance, jagama, I came, can hardly be reconstructed except as coming from gegoma, not at least if you also want to account for the attested Greek forms, Gothic forms, and so on. So to keep it all together, you have to assume that there was first a form gegoma. Now, because of the influence of the A on the initial G, this becomes jegoma, and then the vowels change and this becomes jagama. Now, you know, you have upstream explanations. Yes, maybe here something special happened. Well, I cannot fully exclude that.
Thank you.